capitalism and communism are the same religion. So as capitalism grows, it reinforces communism. As communism grows, it reinforces capitalism. Why? Because both believe that economics, materialism, is the underlying reality. Okay? Religion doesn't matter. So capitalism spreads by making everyone uniform, by turning everyone into an economic animal, right? Because today, we don't ask you to believe in God, we ask you to go buy things. Communism is the same way. Communism believes that as long as there's equality, as long as there's no property, everyone will be happy. So it's ironic that these two ideas, capitalism and communism, even though they were mortal enemies in the 20th century, the underlying basis of the religion is the same. And as they develop, they reinforce each other.
Hi, this is Jerry, and that right there is Professor Jiang Xueqin. To explain why this segment from one of his videos really resonated with me, I'm going to tell you guys a story. When I was in college, I talked to a libertarian. For those of you who don't know what a libertarian is, I will define what a libertarian is in a second. I told this libertarian, I said, there's things about libertarianism that I agree with, and then there's things I don't agree with. So I'm not a complete hardcore libertarian. That's what I told him. So here's the question he asked me almost immediately without thinking. He said, so you're a Marxist? And that question took me aback. There were so many logical fallacies. Somehow he created this axis where on one end, it was a libertarian. On the other end, it was a Marxist. And by saying I don't agree completely with libertarianism, and in his case, he was what's called an anarcho-capitalist, labeled me as a Marxist. And he wasn't doing it, I think, maliciously. That was just the paradigm he was brought up with. And if you hear the story now, you could probably understand why this point that Professor Jiang was talking about really resonated with me. So let's explore from here. Let's explore from Professor Jiang's little lecture segment and my story, and let's explore all this. A lot of people in the West love using this little model. Now, I am drawing it a little differently than probably what you've seen. The way you've seen it, it's probably 4 different squares, but I'm doing it more graphically like this. The reason I'm using this model is because it's very easy to explain what a libertarian is if you use this paradigm. Economic freedoms on one axis, social freedoms on the other axis, and you could substitute freedom with liberty. Maybe liberty is actually an even better word. So economic liberty on the y-axis and social liberty on the x-axis. If you think economics and social, aka personal stuff, should be controlled, you're probably an authoritarian. Modern conservatives in America would be probably up here, as in they're like free markets, lower taxes, etc., don't interfere with my business, but we got to regulate a lot of things socially. We got to regulate violence in video games. We got to regulate marriage. We got to regulate all these social political freedoms. A modern day progressive, right, what people nowadays call a liberal, a modern day progressive would be very cool about social freedoms. But economically, they're like, we got to redistribute wealth. We got to tax the millionaires. We got to control businesses, etc., etc. So that's what a progressive is. I don't want to use the word liberal because a liberal should not really be defined as someone that agrees with control. And in fact, what's funny is both progressives and conservatives have co-opted that word liberal. Conservatives, in response to progressives calling themselves liberals, call themselves neoliberals, right? But it's kind of the same thing. But let's throw those words out and think about what an actual liberal, aka classical liberal, so now called a libertarian, what that is. And so if you follow this graph, a libertarian is basically someone that thinks socially, aka personal, and economically, you shouldn't regulate. You should give them as much liberty as possible. Of course, I mentioned the word anarcho-capitalist, and anarcho-capitalist would just be an extreme version of that. As small government as possible, if not no government, capitalism as the means of exchange and production, and maximal freedom. I think an immediate thing some of you will have, and this is why what Professor Jiang talked about resonated with me, is just like when that libertarian back in college asked me if I were a Marxist, many of you would be like, why would you base your understanding of the world? Why would you base your entire paradigms, your ideologies, whatever word, big words, on just these 2 factors? let's brainstorm some other things that might really matter to someone. I'm going to start here, okay? Shout out my friend Matthew. Some people really care about the faith aspects, and Professor Jiang talks a lot about faith in his lectures too. Maybe what, why, and how you believe in the world and what it should be and what it is and what we should do. Maybe some people really care about the faith, the religious aspects. Faith is another proxy for, is there absolute truth, right? Is there something that is the thing that we all have to strive for? Some people care a lot about tradition, right? So these terms I'm using maybe more from sociology, more from big picture analysis of society. Some people very honor bound, man. Some people care a lot about tradition. There's a psychologist that I read back in college who also has different factors that he says people really care about. So care harm is an axis, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, sometimes called purity, and liberty. Maybe some of these can be tied into that economic and personal social liberty axis that we were looking at before. Granted, whenever you put a model for anything, right, it's a simplification of the truth. Of course, the world's complicated. If a model doesn't cover the most essential and the most relevant parts of what you're trying to describe, then maybe that model is at best incomplete, at worst misleading. And that's why Professor Jiang's assertion that this whole communism or Marxism or capitalism, all this type of political economy stuff, at best it's just a limited way of looking at the world. At worst, and this is something that I think he implies that I probably agree with, it's a way, whether deliberate or not, to brainwash us into not seeing the entire reality, not seeing the entire truth.
But because capitalism and communism were able to spread so fast, we've been brainwashed into thinking that only economics matters. Okay? So, for example, when you read the newspaper, it's always, what's the GDP this year? What's the employment rate this year? What's the inflation rate this year? What's the price of eggs this year? It's never, how do people feel spiritually? How are people religiously? Okay? It's never about your psychology. It's never about your spirituality. It's always about how much money do you have. Okay? So communism and capitalism together conquer the world.
One measure that I really like to show people, and shout out Chris and Jordan because I was telling them about this, there's something called the Human Development Index. Professor Jiang mentioned GDP, right? So GNI is a slightly more advanced version of measuring GDP, but it's basically the same thing. I'm not going to get into specifics, but so you can think of this as GDP, but the HDI, aka the Human Development Index, also has life expectancy, educational expectation, so how much are people expected to get educated, and then the average education attainment, so not just the expectation, but then do people fulfill that? As a guy that really cares about information, as a guy that really cares about knowledge, I, of course, would gravitate towards HDI. Some of you watching would be like, there's a big one that I think our modern society cares a lot about that we haven't even looked at. What do you think that is, guys? Happiness, right? None of these systems put the word happiness or whatever proxy for it into it, but that's something in modern day we really care about, and maybe it was always the case. Long story short, all of this should show you that whatever ways of looking at the world are strictly that, just ways of looking at the world. And I encourage all of you to examine the ways you look at the world and then think about, are there other ways of looking at the world? Can I combine certain things? Are certain ways of looking at the world maybe too simplistic, if not misleading? Because it's easy to argue within limited paradigms of understanding, but if you step beyond it, be like, should we even be arguing about this? Spending time and money and resources on things that shouldn't even matter. Let's think about things outside of this. Thank you guys so much for watching. For those of you who are new, please press subscribe. For those of you who got recommended this and have subscribed, thank you. The fact that you chose to click on this means a lot to me. We always emphasize step out of the box and think. And today's just another example of that. But I think today's example is one of those where it will determine the future of where this world goes. There's different levels of stepping outside the box and think, right? And we're going really big picture here. In any case, this was the second video on Professor Jiang. If you haven't seen the first one, make sure to watch it. I'm going to put it in the end cards. I was really surprised how much discussion was on my first video. So I'm really excited, and we're going to do more. So thank you guys so much. Talk soon. Looking forward to a lot of discussion. Society needs it, people. So try your best. Be civil about it. If you can't, just write what you wanted to write, take a break, come back, and see if you could write it better. Okay, talk to you guys soon.